Hello and welcome everyone to the Growing Together 2017 Winter Webcast Series. This is offered to you by the Iowa Master Gardener Program, and today we're going to be exploring donation in small space gardens. My name is Susan DeBleek and I'm the Assistant Coordinator for the Master Gardener Program here in Iowa. The Winter Webinar Series is a three-part series that we're using to focus on food security in Iowa and also to give you some gardening best practices. Today is the first in the three-part series focused on donation gardens and small space gardens. We're going to talk about measuring the impact of Master Gardener volunteers and building community partnerships. And then the third webcast is going to focus on growing asparagus and harvesting vegetables. In today's webcast, we're going to learn about results from the Iowa State University Research Farm Demonstration Gardens, where in 2016, Master Gardeners grew produce for donation to food pantries. And then we're also going to hear about efficient small space gardening. So the donation garden presentation is going to be about 40 minutes, and there will be a couple pauses for you to discuss with your small group. And then the small space gardening presentation will be about 70 minutes. A couple materials we have for you to follow along. We do have a worksheet, so feel free to take notes there. And we also have a link to the online evaluation, so please give us feedback on what you've gained from this presentation. This is a reminder to log your continuing education hours. Master Gardeners gain 2 continuing education hours, and they are required to log 10 continuing education hours each year. And so please log on to the volunteer reporting system to log those hours. I'd now like to hand it over to Dr. Cindy Haynes and Laura Irish.
Welcome to our webinar. I'm Cynthia Haynes and Laura Irish is here as well, and we're going to be talking to you today about the 2016 Home Demonstration Gardens. I'm Cindy Haynes. I'm Associate Professor in the Department of Horticulture. My responsibilities are in teaching. I teach several classes each semester, and I'm also an Extension Consumer Horticulture Specialist.
And my name is Laura Irish, and I'm a graduate student in the Department of Horticulture and Sustainable Agriculture, which is an interdisciplinary major that I'm participating in. And my research focuses on master gardeners, so you listening right now, and cultivar trials that you are also participating in.
For a little bit of an overview of our webinar, we're going to talk a little bit about the home demonstration gardens, give you a little bit of a background about it. We are going to focus the majority of this presentation on the 2016 home demonstration gardens and what our themes were and some of the results that we collected from some of the different trials, as well as some lessons that we learned during this process. We'll end it with the 2017 home demonstration garden themes and objectives and what we hope to accomplish in the next year. First off, the home demonstration gardens started in 1977. It started before me, and it's been going for almost 40 years. In fact, next year, 2017, will be our 40th year. We have had the home demonstration gardens at many of the ISU research and demonstration farms throughout Iowa. We've been at as many as 10 or as few as 5. So we've had them at quite a few different locations. The primary objective of the home demonstration gardens at each of these ISU research and demonstration farms is to showcase new or unusual cultivars or practices working with annual flowers and vegetables. And its targeted audience is for the home gardener. We invite that public or the general public to attend the field days, which are usually in August, late July or early August, and we've had as many as just a couple of hundred to almost 1,000 attendees at some of these different field days. Each year, the new theme focuses on a variety of topics, so it changes each year, and it's wide-ranging, except for that it always revolves around or is related to those annual vegetables or flowers. In 2016, the home demonstration gardens were located at 7 different sites. We typically select sites across the state with varying soil conditions and slightly different environmental conditions as well. All of these sites are at the ISU Research and Demonstration Gardens, except the one in Rock Rapids, which is actually located at the Lyon County Fairgrounds. In 2016, the themes for the home demonstration gardens were a pantry garden. So everything that we grew, those common vegetables that we grew, we donated as much as possible to a local food pantry. We had a target of 10,000 pounds of produce to be donated from all of the farms that we were growing. We also had a quarter of the garden dedicated to a pollinator garden. This means that we were growing annual flowers and herbs that attract pollinators either as a nectar source or as a food source. So it worked out really well to have that pollinator garden there because many of these farms also have a monarch consortium garden, a collection of milkweed and other types of flowers that attract monarchs. So we tied in a little bit with that. We're not going to focus on the pollinator garden in this presentation. Just know that it was very successful. Our focus today, though, will be more on the pantry garden. Before we started this project, we asked food pantries what they wanted. Not all food pantries accept fresh produce, so we wanted to make sure whatever we donated would be accepted and that could be given out as quickly as possible. So some of the produce that we were looking for, we wanted to make sure the food pantries would accept. And these are some of the things that they told us that they wanted. Green beans, squash, melon, cucumbers, potatoes, onions, bell peppers. They wanted cherry tomatoes because that's easy to eat, very easy to fix. And in most instances, we grew exactly what they requested with the exception of cherry tomatoes. We decided that if we were going to take data on tomatoes, that cherry tomatoes would be a lot of harvest time. And we didn't want to put our master gardeners through that one. We still have tomatoes in the garden, but it's not the cherry type.
So this project focuses on a partnership with SNAP-Ed, which is the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program Education. And the grant objectives included short, medium, and long-term goals. And for our project at the Home Demonstration Gardens, we focused mainly on short-term outcomes, such as food safety, which includes things like hand washing and sanitizing produce and things like that, needs and readiness, which is where master gardeners would participate in trainings that discussed food security and issues related with that, and to also create with partnerships other than just extension. So we're talking about connections with food pantries and the Iowa State Research and Demonstration Farms. Some of the medium and long-term goals for this project include overall healthy eating, so that access to the fresh fruits and vegetables, and an increase of food safety. So that is where you can obtain fresh produce in a socially acceptable manner.
This is the first time we've worked with SNAP-Ed in the Master Gardener program, and it was very successful. We've gotten a lot of really good access for, I think, people in Iowa, as well as a lot of knowledge gain and publicity for the Master Gardener program through this partnership. Some of the objectives for the 2016 home demonstration gardens that we really focused on, which were these more short-term goals, were to see how much we could actually donate to a local food bank or pantry. We wanted to donate as much as possible. We're gardeners, so we should know how to do this. We also wanted to increase awareness of food insecurity in Iowa, particularly to those attendees those that came to those different field days. So not necessarily for the master gardeners, but any of the general public. We also wanted to trial different cultivars of vegetables. This was important to us because we want to produce the most productive vegetables that we possibly can. So we want to know if this cultivar is more productive than this cultivar, so that we can then recommend these to the home gardener, and then we can also recommend these for future demonstration gardens or mini grant participants that, you need to try this cultivar because it's really productive. And then finally, because we're taking data on cultivars, we wanted to know the perceptions of the master gardeners as they were working and collecting this data, because they are now citizen scientists. So they go through this process like most of us do in collecting data and that science, which is fairly rigorous and important, at least to us. Our first objective was to donate to those food banks.
So as you can see with this graph, it shows all 7 of our home demonstration gardens and where they're located. And the blue is the total amount of produce that was harvested at each garden. And the orange shows the total marketable or donated produce from each farm. The important thing is to look at the top of the blue bar and then look at that gap down to the top of the orange bar. That area is our non-marketable or unsuitable produce, things that weren't donated to the local food pantries. So this is for reasons like blemishes, damage, such as cracking on tomatoes, and insect damage. There are pretty stark differences between farms. So if you look to the Muscatine and Nashua columns, you can see that Muscatine had a fairly low total harvestable, and that is because of environmental factors. They had a large hail storm and strong winds come through right after planting, which took out a lot of their crop. And you can see these differences throughout most of the farms. So if you combine all of these totals, you'll see that overall the home demonstration gardens donated over 9,000 pounds of fresh vegetables to their local food pantries, which is quite amazing. And we were just shy of our 10,000 pound goal this year, mainly because of the environmental issues that came up. The mini grants that were associated with our project donated over 55,000 pounds of produce, which is another astonishing and amazing number. So we made approximately 17 food pantry relationships or connections with the home demonstration gardens and food pantries. Most of these food pantries were within 20 miles of one of the research farms, and some of them were a little bit further. And the reason that happened is because a lot of these farms are in more rural locations, and so finding available pantries and markets that worked with times that the master gardeners could donate was a challenge. Most of the time, the master gardeners were harvesting and donating 1 to 2 times a week. However, sometimes 3 times a week, they were able to go to the gardens and harvest because of the production of the different cultivars we had. So what does that mean? They're doing all this work, they're donating, they had over 9,000 pounds of produce. Well, that comes out to about 28,000 servings of fresh vegetables to their local Iowans. This is something that we are very proud of, that we can say, we have created this new project to influence fresh vegetable consumption. The entire project, so that includes the mini grants of the 55,000 pounds plus the home demonstration gardens, gives nearly 200,000 servings of fresh vegetables to Iowans in a 4-month period, which is absolutely amazing, and we are very glad that we could be a part of that.
So we think we did pretty well on Objective 1, even though we didn't meet our target of 10,000 pounds. And we were hoping we could do equally as well on Objective 2. Objective 2 is where we're looking at that awareness of food insecurity in Iowa. We know that it's actually more than what you might think. So 1 in 8 Iowans are considered food insecure. So we targeted this one at our field day attendees. This happens usually in late July or early August, where we invite the public to come to the different farms for an evening, and they learn a little something about what we're growing and what worked well and what didn't work well in the garden. This year we had 300 to 400 attendees for these field days, and Laura did a really good job of corralling about 150 of them to complete surveys. The surveys were a 17-question survey that had 14 close-ended questions and 3 open-ended questions. And it took about 10 minutes to complete, and most people were more than willing to participate.
So one of the questions that was asked on this field day survey was the before and after knowledge about food security. So the attendees said for before that only 23% felt that they had a really good knowledge about food security. And then if you look at the after graph, you can see that 54%, so over double, said after this field day, we know a lot about food security. So you can look that 99% after our field day said, I have somewhat or a lot of knowledge about food security, which is a great knowledge gain for these attendees. The second question from the field day survey and for the attendees was about how comfortable they felt discussing food security with others. Again, if you look at the green part of the before graph, 12% said they felt pretty comfortable discussing this. And then you look at the after, and again, over double now feel quite comfortable discussing food security with others. So again, you can see how much impact our field days are having on the different attendees. This question asked about the donation patterns of the field day attendees. So the blue is the before. So did you donate to a food pantry before attending this field day? And the orange is after. So do you plan on donating to a food pantry after this field day? And the numbers are the number of participants, so not the percent. And if you look at the middle column that says no, the before number was almost 90 attendees said, no, I did not or I have not donated to a food pantry before. Now after it, it's only a little bit above 20 people said they won't donate to food pantries, which is 70 people that are now maybe or absolutely saying, yes, I will donate to a food pantry if I'm able. And why is this important? Well, over 80% of the attendees to our field days were not master gardeners. And over 80% also had a fruit and vegetable garden at home, which means we have all of this extra produce that can be donated to our local pantries. So that impact of discussing with people who aren't master gardeners and encouraging them to think about donating is quite important for these field days.
So we think we did pretty well on Objective 2 as well. So we connected with some in the local community, particularly those attendees at field days are usually within a 50-mile radius of that farm, so they are very much a local community member. We'll work on advertising for more connections and getting more people to those field days, I think, in 2017. Our Objective 3 is where we really got master gardeners involved. This was the cultivar trial. So we had 13 different vegetables that we were trialing in the home demonstration garden, in the pantry garden in particular. 43 different cultivars of these 13 different vegetables. So many of them we had 2 cultivars that we were trialing, or up to 4 cultivars were actually being trialed.
So here you can see for the green beans that we trialed, we have 4 different cultivars at the bottom of the graph. And the blue denotes the count, so the actual number of green beans. And the orange is the weight, so how much the green beans weighed overall. And we're looking at the percent marketable. So this is the percent of the total number of, let's say, provider beans that are marketable or were marketable for our trials. If you look at the Bush Blue Lake, you can see that it has a lower count, but a higher weight, which tells us that it has a larger bean. However, if you compare it to Lewis or Coulter, it has a much lower percent marketable. So what that tells us is that you may have larger beans on Bush Blue Lake, but a higher percent of them you will not be able to donate, which is really important for us when we start looking at what cultivars we would tell people to grow in their garden, because you don't want to have to count a lot more Bush Blue Lake just to make up for the marketability. For the cucumbers, we have this time count and weight on the bottom of the graph, and the colors tell you which cultivar. So Marketmore 76 is the blue and Sweet Slice is the orange. And again, we're looking at percent marketable. So the Sweet Slice has a much lower count and a slightly higher weight, which tell us that each cucumber is quite a bit larger. However, you can see that a little over 82% of the Sweet Slice were marketable, whereas for the Marketmore, over 85% were marketable. So there is quite a big difference between, again, the percent marketable versus the size. So you need both to choose a good cultivar for a garden. In peppers, we're going back to the cultivars being at the bottom of the graph. So again, the blue is the count, and the orange is the weight. I want you to look at the third column, so the Vanguard cultivar. You can see that the count is much lower than the others, and the weight is higher. So we know that that pepper is a large pepper for its average weight, and that is great if you are a home gardener and you know, okay, I want to donate, but I don't want to pick a lot. So to get that weight, we want a larger average weight when compared to these other three cultivars. Potatoes, just like the peppers, the cultivars are on the bottom with the count and weight in blue and orange. And we haven't seen much difference in the size of the potatoes between these four cultivars. However, we will eventually run statistics to see if what we're seeing is actually correct. For zucchini squash, we are switching back to count and weight at the bottom with the Green Machine in blue and the Dunja in orange. And we can see that the Dunja has a higher count relative to the Green Machine, and they're pretty similar in weight, which tells us that it is it's usually harvested smaller than the Green Machine, which is okay because look at the percent difference in marketable numbers in the count. So again, we might have a smaller overall, but you would have more marketable produce to then donate.
We do have one disclaimer with Objective 3, and that is the fact that we haven't completed, Laura hasn't completed all the statistics on that one. We are looking at, and we will determine if there are any statistical differences between these cultivars so that we can help determine which ones we might want to recommend. We know there's a variability by location, and that will influence some of the data. We can see it in the data now. So there probably is a by farm effect, our statistical differences. But all of this is good in collecting this information because it provides a more complete story to how these cultivars actually worked at the different farms and throughout Iowa. So that's the one disclaimer. There's another disclaimer that we have as well, one concern that kind of cropped up when collecting this data. It's a lot to harvest, all of these different cultivars at all of these different farms. And we're asking a lot of our Master Gardener volunteers to do it. But what we found is that collecting that marketable and non-marketable produce is really important. So marketable means it's nice, healthy, relatively blemish-free, something that you would see in a grocery store. Non-marketable doesn't necessarily mean it's not edible. It's just not suitable for sale. It may be cracked. It may have some insect damage. It may not be edible. It may be all mush. But that non-marketable portion is not something we're going to send to a food pantry. And towards the end of the season, we found, or we heard, that several places were not harvesting all the crop that could be harvested, which means they weren't harvesting the non-marketable tomatoes or the non-marketable squash. They were just letting it, they maybe were just letting it rot in the garden. And that's a great way to save some time in your home garden, but it doesn't give us the complete story on that cultivar. It means that our non-marketable numbers are off. They're not telling the whole story, because we really want in our home gardens that Pony Express tomato that has 90% marketable produce compared to another tomato that may only has 70% marketable, because it has a tendency to crack more often. So this will be one of those things we stress in next year's garden, is that we harvest everything, and maybe we sort them in the garden before we bring them in, so that that non-marketable, we get a better accurate count of that non-marketable number. Objective 4 was looking at master gardeners as citizen scientists. And we also recognized during this process that the citizen science aspect of this is hard to explain. It's hard to tell someone how data should be collected and why this is important and why we need to be consistent in this collection or in this particular manner throughout the growing season. We started this off with training, and Laura went to 6 home demonstration gardens and hosted trainings. 38 master gardeners attended. They had training on data collection as well as food safety, and in this particular image they're doing a hand washing activity, so there were activities there as well. 32 of those master gardeners were then involved in harvesting at the home demonstration gardens, and out of that small subset of master gardeners that were involved in the citizen science project, we then collected data from them on their perceptions of citizen science.
So part of the survey that was given asked about the process of data collection and that knowledge gain through working on this project, and that includes the trainings and harvesting. So this quote that I found very powerful from one of our master gardeners from helping in this 2016 season was, "I had very little knowledge about handling food safety, cleaning and sanitizing it, the produce, for consumption by others. The training we received at the beginning of the growing season, coupled with the hands-on work with the produce we harvested, greatly increased my skill and knowledge about food safety." So we can see from this one instance that without the training coupled with harvesting and taking the data, it might not have been as effective as a citizen scientist to learn data collection. Another question that I asked on the survey was the influence of biases. And this was, this quote was from one of the challenges, like what was a barrier to this project? And this master gardener said, "Some of the data collected seemed overly complicated. For example, weighing and counting the number of green beans was time consuming, and I think that enough data could have been collected by weighing only." Well, if you think back to our previous slides where I talked about the difference in cultivars, we needed both the count and the weight to make good, sound decisions, which I guess I should say we will hopefully use that to make good statistical decisions on cultivar selection. But it's also good for a home gardener to know the different sizes, the average weight, so that's why you need the count and the total weight, to know the average weight, because, for instance, if you want smaller green beans for a French-style cooking and so you can fillet them and make them small, you're going to want a cultivar that has generally smaller beans. Whereas if you're looking to can, you might want a green bean that has a larger average weight. So this is really important that we get both those counts and numbers, even for the green beans, because we want to paint the right picture about the cultivars themselves.
What we know about our population that took the citizen science survey is that 75% are 65 or older, and about 75% are female. What we also know about Iowans in general is that 12% of Iowans that are 60 or over, so that would be a little bit more than just that 75% that you see on the left, are food insecure. So food insecurity can be more of an issue, or can be a big issue, depending on age. While we also know from Laura's survey that most of the Master Gardeners, or all the Master Gardeners that we surveyed for this section, were not food insecure, it's important for us to remind them and other Master Gardeners that that population of food insecure is quite high among older Iowans, and they probably know someone, or you probably know someone who is food insecure, because that 12% is about 1 in 8. So that's pretty high, and we want to make sure that that awareness is in our Master Gardener population as well as the general population. We learned a lot from this particular project. We've learned a lot about citizen science. We've learned a lot about food pantries. We've learned a lot about creating partnerships with others. And some of the lessons that we've learned from the 2016 SNAP-Ed partnership with Master Gardeners and the ISU Research and Demonstration Farms, we hope to use so that we can better this for 2017. Some of those lessons that we learned is that we need to recruit Master Gardeners earlier in the process. And this is one of the reasons for this particular webinar. We want to show you how good we've done, but we could do so much more with your help. So we're recruiting you right now to get involved in this project. We've focused on 6 ISU research farms for next year. Those were the places where we could get the Master Gardener involvement, and we really want to keep that Master Gardener involvement at those 6 different ISU research farms. We've also determined that we need to do a better job of telling you, the Master Gardener, and the superintendents what this job requires. We also need to do a better job communicating with both our Master Gardeners and our farm superintendents on the jobs that are required in doing these tasks. And there are quite a few of them. So we're creating job descriptions for both the farm superintendents and for the Master Gardeners, so that the Master Gardeners who are walking on site for the first time know that this is my priority. This is what I need to be doing. And this is what the farm superintendent will be doing. And this is how they can support me in what I need to be doing. Doesn't mean that Master Gardeners can't do more, because many times Master Gardeners do, but that we can kind of create that kind of communications, or we at least have those expectations clearly outlined from the get-go. We also need to focus a little bit more on certain aspects in training. We need to talk a little bit more about data collection and why we emphasize certain areas when we're collecting information. So we will emphasize the collection of more of the non-marketable produce. We will emphasize food safety. We might emphasize even some team building exercise. So get to know your fellow Master Gardeners. And I think we'll probably be emphasizing as well in some of those trainings the importance of what you're doing and the impact that what you're doing, and spending all those hours counting beans, what it means to your local community. We've also found that we need to make it easier. So sometimes that means buying certain materials or supplies can make it a lot easier. So having a bucket to put in those tomatoes that are not marketable, and that you can just write on the outside that it's a count of how many non-marketable Pony Express tomatoes that there are there. We can take that and make it easy to weigh and then dump in the compost pile afterwards. So lots of things based on your suggestions, things that we've learned from 2016 that we hope to use for 2017. Some of our themes for 2017, we will continue with a pantry garden and a cultivar trial. We will continue with some of the vegetables that were requested from the food pantry gardens. So yes, beans will be on the list. So will cucumbers and onions and squash and tomato and potato. We might limit the number of cultivars. So there may not be 4 cultivars of beans. There might be 2. We will continue to have full-size tomatoes, not cherry tomatoes. And we may have just Irish potatoes or white potatoes instead of sweet potatoes. And some of this is because the quality of the plants that we got in early, we want to do everything that we can so that it's successful throughout the growing season. So having the best quality that we can start off with usually means we have better quality at the end. We're going to turn that pantry garden into a space-saving garden. So we know that having the most productive cultivars really increase what we can donate. The next thing that we know to increase production is to look at some of those space-saving gardening techniques. Sometimes this means gardening is a little more intensive, but it's also something that can be applicable to those who live in apartments or condominiums, and it may be attractive to people who have limited space. So we can tell them how to grow things in containers or window boxes, or if you have a 4x4 square foot gardening situation. We're also going to emphasize using recycled materials so that we can keep some of this on the cheap. So make it very accessible to those that maybe don't have a lot of money to put into a raised bed. So space-saving techniques using recycled materials, we hope will also increase production, and then we will more than make that 10,000 pound mark. Another theme that we will have for 2017 is probably edible flowers. We always have flowers in the home demonstration garden. We like the fact that they're attracting the pollinators and they bring more to the garden than just a vegetable. This year, I think the edible flowers will be very popular. We will have some things like nasturtiums and a few other things as well. And that's a fun way to kind of connect with those who are looking for ornamental things from the garden as well. We will probably also have unusual or new cultivars of flowers as well, because we like to kind of look at and trial some of these to see how they will work in different locations across Iowa. That this particular aspect or this particular theme will not require any data collection. So we can just wander through the garden and eat flowers and be happy. So how do you get involved? We want you to be involved in this. By first, if you are a master gardener, contact your local county master gardener coordinator. They should have information about these 6 sites and the demonstration gardens and farms that they're counties that they're located in. You can also visit the Master Gardener website. There's information on how to get involved there and information on how successful we've been with this SNAP-Ed partnership. Susan DeBleek is kind of our coordinator for the different county coordinators. And if you are unaware if your county coordinator or your county coordinator doesn't know much about this particular project, Susan can put you in contact with a county coordinator who is more familiar with it. It's only in 6 different counties across the state, while they still have master gardeners outside of those counties that are involved. So don't think that you have to be a Muscatine master gardener to be involved or a Story County master gardener to be involved in the Ames garden. I'm sure more than that are certainly accepted. And for those of you that are not part of the Master Gardener program, now's the time for me to recruit you to sign up to be a Master Gardener. Training is in the fall. Master Gardeners will welcome you to help out, particularly on this particular project. If you want to come to one of the farm and help harvest, or if you want to help get the produce to the food banks, all of that is certainly needed. We do ask that you become part of the training so that you have some of that food safety and data collection training prior to actually the planting and the harvesting of the gardens. And then we'll also recruit you heavily so that you become part of that Master Gardener training in the fall. We want you as Master Gardeners. So talk to some other Master Gardeners that are sitting near you or in the same room to find out more. Our goals for 2017 are to break that 10,000 pound ceiling. In fact, I'm going to probably up that to 12 or 15,000 pounds. Let's see if we can reach that. I think it depends a little bit on environmental conditions, but I think we would have made 12,000 pounds easily if it hadn't been for a hailstorm and a bacterial problem on tomatoes. So I think it's very attainable. We're going to continue to encourage more partnerships with local food pantries. We want to involve at least 24, maybe 25 different food pantries. We want to involve them actually in the field days as well. So we want to invite them to come and talk about the impact of these donations on what they see in their clientele. We want to try and connect with more the public, more gardeners at some of these field days. We know through some of the field days we can reach over 500 attendees. We also know that the majority of those attendees are not Master Gardeners. So this is a great way to get more information out so that we can double the impact and then have those people donating to food pantries as well. And maybe we can recruit more into becoming involved in the Master Gardener program too. So it's a win-win for everyone. And then finally, in the next year, in 2017, Laura will complete, she's laughing, Laura will complete her analysis of perceptions of Master Gardeners and citizen scientists. So if you're involved in this project, she will survey you again. She may even interview you as well to see what your perceptions of this data collection, the harvesting, and the procedures that we use, which may be a little more time consuming, but what that means to you and what we find out at the end. And your impact, that impact you have on maybe how you view science and what we do here at Iowa State. And with that, I think we'll wrap it up and say that we've really appreciated all the Master Gardeners who have helped us on this project. It doesn't sound like a lot of Master Gardeners, but we've had many Master Gardeners involved in this project through both the home demonstration gardens and the mini grants, and we appreciate greatly all that you've done. And Laura appreciates them as well. She's nodding. If you need to contact us with questions about any of this information, you have our emails up on the screen, or you can contact your local county coordinator. They can get our phone numbers and this information as well. Thank you so much for being involved in this webinar, and we hope to see you in 2017.
Thank you, Cindy and Laura. I'd now like to hand it over to Dr. Denny Schrock to talk to us about small space gardening.
Hello, and welcome to this presentation on small space gardening. I'm Dr. Denny Schrock, the State Master Gardener Coordinator. As you can see here, our opening slide is of the world's smallest front yard. That's a little humorous take on a yard that I saw near the beach in Santa Monica, California. You can see only about 1 foot wide and 5 feet long. I don't know how they possibly mow that lawn that they've got there. I guess at that size of yard that you can get out your little hedge trimmers, and that's all it's going to take. So this is not necessarily the example of the small space that we're going to be talking about, but it certainly is a small space garden. What are we talking about when we talk about small space gardening? Well, there's various examples, and it is something along the order of this. So we've got what I call pocket plantings, that is pockets of small planting areas. And in this case, this is variegated liriope and Roseanne geranium that are kind of bounded by a sidewalk on one side and a wall on the other side. So it's just a small area you've got for planting. Another example of small space gardening would be container combinations of all sorts. And just the example we've got here, there's the alocasia, there's a canna, there's some petunias and papyrus in the large container that we've got there. There's also a flowering nicotiana. And then on the right, we've got an example of various intensive vegetable gardens. And that happens to be all different types of Swiss chard that are planted in a wide row space that can be harvested for greens and other purposes. What we're not looking at when we're talking about small space gardening are just the specific things like fairy gardens or miniature gardens. Now, certainly those are a type of small space garden, but we're not wanting to limit ourselves to just those types of specific container gardens. They're certainly lots of fun to do, but they're not necessarily, when we're talking about small space gardening, we're not necessarily talking about that small a scale. What we'll be talking about today are several different categories or parts of the small space gardening aspect. So we're going to start out by talking about what some of the advantages are of small space gardening. Then we'll go into some of the tips and techniques that might be used for working with small spaces. And then I'm going to provide you with some examples and ideas of various techniques and samples of gardens that have been used or formed to make small space gardens. So to start out with here on the small space gardening advantages, one of the things that we might look at would be that small space gardening tends to accommodate all abilities, whether it be physical limitations. As you can see there on the left, we've got an adaptive gardening tool that makes reaching easier. It's also in a raised bed that's wheelchair accessible. So you're not going to have acres and acres of that type of garden, but you can do it on a smaller scale and continue gardening when you may not have the ability to do so otherwise. On the right there, you can see my granddaughter Catherine from a few years ago helping pot up a container garden. And for young ones who are just getting into the gardening realm, the small space like a container garden is a great way to get them interested in gardening and not be overwhelming for them. Another advantage of small space gardening is that it's relatively inexpensive to get started when you're doing it on a smaller scale. So you might purchase just a few seed packets and you can grow some vegetables and without much of an investment. You know, a few dollars there can produce a lot of vegetables for your family. Also, you don't have to get a lot of fancy equipment. You don't need a big rototiller, so maybe a shovel and a rake, trowel or something like that, a few tools, and that's all you really need to get started. A third advantage of small space gardening is that it's easy to optimize the soil conditions that you have when you're just dealing with a small space. On the left here, you can see compost being added to some raised beds. You can see that the underlying soil that was basically topsoil scraped away, very clay-like underneath, but by adding in some compost, you can turn that into a productive vegetable garden bed. On the right, we see some sheet composting with seaweed. You know, whatever you've got as your organic matter to do some sheet composting. We probably don't have a lot of seaweed here in Iowa. This one happened to be in Alaska where I took that photo. But there are other materials you can use for sheet composting to build up the soil and improve the soil. In ornamental planting beds, you know, sort of sheet composting with wood chips. They break down over time and build up the soil. Yet another advantage of small space gardening is that it's relatively easy to correct whatever mistakes that you might have made to start with. Here you can see the heavy cloddy soil in that raised bed. it definitely needs some breaking up with organic matter. And because it's a relatively small space, I was able to add a lot of compost in this bed and correct the problem of poor drainage and not good aeration in the soil because of the heavy compacted clay. Yet another advantage of small space gardening is that you're going to generally need less maintenance because you have fewer plants to take care of. So whether it be weeding, as we see on the left, pulling some weeds out of the dianthus, or deadheading, where we're cutting off the spent flowers of geraniums on the right, generally, when you've got a small space to deal with, it's going to be less time consuming and less tedious to take care of those things. The one instance where I can think of a disadvantage of small space is that when we're growing things in containers, typically you need to water and fertilize more frequently than you do in in-ground beds. So there could be a disadvantage there, and that small space if you're trying to grow too much in a confined area. Similarly, on the management end of things, it's easier to manage pest problems when you're dealing with just a small space of plant materials. So whether it's out inspecting your plants regularly for possible pest problems, such as the golden aphids that you see on the butterfly milkweed there, or the swamp milkweed actually is where this one is showing up, those golden aphids. Certainly when you've got just a few plants, it's pretty easy to get out a hose and wash off those aphids so that they won't come back. Or check on the plants so that you don't have a lot of problems or they don't become a major problem. Another small space advantage is that it's pretty easy to modify the growing environment when you're only dealing with a relatively confined area. So on the left there, you can see some window screening propped up over a vegetable garden in late summer. This is in August when trying to start some of your fall planted crops. Typically in August, things get pretty hot and dry out very quickly. So in order to get those seeds to germinate well, it's often beneficial to provide a little bit of shading in the garden. And that's pretty easy to do when you've just got a small patch like this to get that lettuce or spinach started for a fall crop. Similarly, you can often extend the growing season by using something like floating row covers. And here these floating row covers are propped up over tomatoes so that they can get through that early frost. You know, so oftentimes we get a light frost in September, but we won't get a real heavy freeze until late in October, so that you can get another perhaps month of growing season out of your crops by doing the frost protection there. What we'd like you now to do is take a little break here and think about what advantages or disadvantages that you can think of or have you experienced when you're gardening in small spaces. Use the ones we've had in discussion so far as ideas or a sounding board, but see what else you can come up with for ideas there. Welcome back. Now we're going to move into the second portion of our presentation to talk about some of the techniques that will be used to accommodate the smaller spaces that we're dealing with when we're dealing with small space gardening. One of those would be to use what vertical space you have by employing trellises. Some examples we see here, the one on the far left is actually a rooftop garden where beans are grown on bamboo stakes in a teepee-type trellis. So they take advantage of that vertical space rather than spreading out and taking up quite as much space. In the middle, it's a twig trellis for peas to climb on. Peas, of course, are vining crop, and unless they have something to climb on, like the twigs or lots of other types of trellises could be put in place too, a fence for them to climb on. But they use that vertical space rather than flopping all over and taking a wide space. Makes the harvest a lot easier as well. Trellises can also be quite decorative. On the far right, you see a number of lattice work type trellises against a brick wall, and those are clematis that are growing up that lattice work. It provides a vertical space for those flowering vines to grow on. Bases are kind of hidden there by a number of container gardens, and there's container gardens on top of the wall as well. So lots of small space techniques can put together in this one little small space. Perhaps somewhat similar to the trellis would be the use of caging for corralling plants or keeping them growing vertically. Again, we've got a couple tomato examples. On the far left, it's the colorful orange hoop tomato cages that will keep the tomato vines corralled inside that hoop. Often, if you're doing indeterminate tomatoes, they get much bigger than those hoops, so you may need to have something a little bit more substantial. And in the middle there, you see those are 2x2 trellises that have been constructed out of wood, and those will help confine the tomatoes, and they can be made as tall as you need to control those indeterminately growing tomatoes that keep on sprawling all season long. At the far right, it's actually a peony hoop in which the Shasta daisies are growing. I would say that you usually want to make that hoop low enough so that they're not going to detract from the flowers, but they will help control the spreading nature of some of those perennials. Also similar to trellising, that is making use of the vertical space, would be the use of stakes. Some plants are just floppy, so like the gladiolus on the far left, that you can kind of twist around that spiral wire stake to keep that plant upright rather than flopping over into nearby plants. A spiral stake such as that is a great technique. Delphiniums there in the middle, you can keep upright with individual bamboo stakes. If you look closely, you can see some of the blue and green bamboo stakes in there. So that keeps them thoroughly upright rather than flopping over into neighboring plants. And we often don't think of trees as needing staking except at planting time. But certainly if you're growing some of the more dwarf versions of apple trees or fruiting trees, they may not stand up real well on their own with their dwarfing rootstock. So they may need something like this metal pipe to keep the plant upright and from flopping over with a trellis in addition to the stake there. A rather unique vertical space is the espalier that's often used for fruit trees. May be as much ornamental as productive use, but it is a means of getting lots of great light penetration and high quality fruit. On the left, this particular type of espalier where the branches kind of grow together to create a lattice work, although it's on a lattice work frame too, but they actually grow together and they'll self-graft. That's called pleaching. And on the right, where we've got the espalier grown up against the wall, takes a lot of pruning to keep that from getting out of hand, but it makes a very ornamental means of producing a lot of fruit in a small space right up against a wall such as that. Here we see another small space technique called succession planting, getting multiple crops out of a small area in one growing season. So whether it be the type of succession planting where we see on the left that sweet corn, not all planted at the same time, but plant in a couple week succession so that you have more of a continual cropping. You also might use that technique to make sure that the varieties don't silk and tassel at the same time, so you don't get cross-pollination of the two different varieties. Or here on the right, we see some broccoli planted nearing its maturity, and we've got some lettuce seedlings planted next to it, so they can come and take over that same space when the broccoli is all harvested. Another way to think of succession planting is to do change-out plantings in the same space or container throughout the season. And it works really well with container gardens such as we see here. You may be able to tell that this is actually the same container in 3 different seasons. So in the springtime, we've got the dried ornamental grass that's still present from winter. Probably going to need to cut it back soon. I can see a little bit of green beginning to start poking through there, and you'll want to remove the dead grass. But right now it adds a little bit of backdrop and interest for the daffodils that are blooming there, the primulas that are blooming. And then there is a couple of evergreen type plants. That's Nandina, which is not hardy here in Iowa, but would be could be brought indoors or into your garage over winter to make it survive. That's the Nandina behind the daffodils. And we can see in later pictures that it's actually Stachys that's at the far left that carries through. So some of those plants carry through there in the summer. We see the Stachys again, the Nandina, and the ornamental grass now in full greenery. And we can also see some lilies in bloom and some dianthus in bloom. And then there's a little euonymus, creeping euonymus there in the foreground to the right. That creeping euonymus carries through to the fall as well, where now the dianthus are switched out with some flowering kale, and the lilies overplanted with the chrysanthemums that are in bloom. Again, Stachys in a fuller plant form, and the ornamental grass taking on its fall color. So the bulbous crops, like the daffodils and lilies, could remain throughout the seasons, but you'd want to cut them back so after the foliage has died down naturally, so that they won't detract from the next season of planting or bloom. Another way to look at succession planting would be what I call the layered planting technique. That is, we have an area that's planted with plants that grow and bloom at different times of the year, but you don't really have to change them out. So this is one of my driveway gardens where in the upper left you can see it early in the springtime. There's some tulips, the bright orangey red, some creeping phlox with pinky purple, some alyssum, the perennial alyssum with the gold, and there's some farther down on the right of that, there's some creeping potentilla in its spring color. There's a flowering quince in the backdrop there. To the right of that is the different view, but the same garden in early summer. So the yucca is blooming. There's some roses blooming. There's some large nepeta blooming. And the pink in the background is actually an opuntia or a cactus that's blooming. But a lot of the spring flowering things are done by now, but these others are taking over in that same garden space. And then in fall, we've got some annuals of marigolds that are filling in for fall color. The cannas are enlarged, and just getting a little bit more color from the ornamental grasses and Russian sage down in the far right. So getting a lot of different colors from different times by having plants kind of planted closely together and filling in the spaces at various times. We also want to think about, if we're doing small space gardening, that you want to make sure that the plants are not just a one and done. That is, you don't want them to have just a quick show and have nothing else the rest of the year. So you want to make sure you're using some plants that have multiple seasons of interest. A good example of that is the black chokeberry that you see here. In the springtime, it sends out lovely blossoms with the pink stamens there, quite attractive. And of course, once those are pollinated, they'll develop into the fruits that you see right below it. Those fruits can hang on to the plant through most of the summer and into fall, ripening to that purpley black in fall. And then a little bit later in the fall, the plant will develop excellent fall color, as you see in the photo on the right. So bright reds with purple undertones make this a plant with really multiple seasons of interest. Another way to think about multiple seasons of interest is just making sure that some of the things that you're planting have a very long bloom cycle. So one of my favorites for that is the Nepeta or catmint. And so I'm showing it here in various combinations, but at various times of the year. So at the far left, you can see those are Siberian iris and Amsonia, backed by Nepeta. That one happens to be Walker's Low. So it makes a nice combination early in the springtime. A little bit later, sort of midsummer, in the middle photo, we see that is Veronica spicata in the foreground with knockout rose, and then backed by another Nepeta. This one happens to be Six Hills Giant, but it blooms just as long as the Walker's Low. And then on the right, we can see a little bit later on, and they'll carry on well into the fall too. The top image there is the Six Hills Giant again with blue fescue, and late enough in the season that the blue fescue has sent up its seed stalk, so you get a little bit of a fall feel there with it. And at the bottom, we see the Amsonia, the same Amsonia that we saw in the first picture, beginning to take on its golden fall color with the Nepeta still blooming, and those are crepe myrtles blooming behind it. Another thing to think about with small space technique is that you want to make sure that you're using compact cultivars. So there are some fantastic plants like the limelight hydrangea on the left there, but it will get to be 6, 8, or even more feet tall. You can see there, compared to the birdhouse up on a pole, it gets to be pretty large, and those flower heads or clusters can easily be a foot or more in diameter. If you've got a small space, that's way out of scale or proportion with the space that you might have. So you might need to find a corollary or comparable plant that has a little bit smaller scale to it. And fortunately, we do have one that's called Little Lime that only gets to be about 3 to 4 feet tall, and the flower heads typically remain only in the 3 to maybe 6 inch diameter. So you can see there, compared to the Echinacea, it's about the same size and a much better scale than would limelight be at 6 or 8 feet tall. Looking at other compact cultivars, look for things that are called dwarfs. So here, just comparing the dwarf orange canna, that's the cultivar name on the left, that only gets to be about 2 to 2.5 feet tall, to the Bengal tiger on the right, which is up to 6 or 8 feet tall. So it gets to be very, very tall. Also, if you look for names of cultivars, things like Nana is a true dwarf. So comparing the Spike Speedwell Veronica spicata on the left, that's about 3 feet tall, with the Spicata Nana on the right, which even with the flower spikes only is about 6 inches tall, 6 inches tall, much better scale for the small space. And this photo harkens back to the one, if you remember back on one of the original photos where I showed the variegated liriope and the Roseanne geranium. Well, this is just a continuation of that same little sidewalk garden. When we're thinking about small spaces, we also want to make sure that we're using all of our senses. Make sure those plants make their worth known. So rather than just thinking about how pretty they look, we may want to make sure that they also have the added element of fragrance. So here's a few examples of fragrant plants you might think about. That's the heliotrope on the left. There's a rose on the right or in the middle there that's called Sun Rosa Fragrant Pink. And in the springtime, this Viburnum carlesii compactum, the Korean spice viburnum, carries a wonderful fragrance that permeates the whole garden. Another sense that we often forget about in the garden is that of sound. So here it's not always plants that are providing that sense of sound, but it may be the sound of moving water, such as this bubbling fountain in a courtyard garden, or the blue ball fountain bubbler that's out in open space. And then we can also get that sound from plants, such as the rustling of ornamental grasses or fall leaves provide a nice rustling sound in the fall when they're in their full glory. Square foot gardening is another technique that's effective for small spaces. Usually when we're talking about square foot gardening, we're thinking of vegetable gardens where the space is marked off into 1 foot grids and you plant a certain number of plants in each square foot depending on the ultimate size of the plant. So for example, one broccoli plant per square foot would be fine, but for radishes you might be putting 9 or 12 or even 16 radishes in a 1 square foot space. We can carry that same thought or format through to ornamentals as well. So in the center there you see the sort of square foot technique used for succulents. The pink flowers there are actually crown of thorn plants, and then there's a number of succulents down the central planting in between all of those. There's a walkway there to the right, but it's a nice way of adding a little bit of color without making it just a solid bare walkway through the whole distance. I've also seen the square foot technique used in a little courtyard garden. This one on the right happens to be in Charleston, where they have little just postage stamp size front yards. And the whole yard was done in sort of a checkerboard with slate-like pavers and grass. And then on one of the pavers, a little urn fountain type container garden was planted up for a little added emphasis and color. Wide row gardening is a great small space technique for the vegetable garden. This is where rather than planting your vegetables in specific rows with wide enough space to walk in between, you plant the vegetables at the same spacing in both directions, so you have a wide row. On the left there you see cauliflower, lettuce, and onions. In the center those are wide row planted beans, and on the right they actually are planted in rows, but by the time they mature they make a solid bed there. That's lettuce, and you can see you can kind of harvest the lettuce as you go along. This was at actually a restaurant that used their own homegrown lettuce to do this. Container gardening is also a great way to get your small spaces. So typically when you're planting things in containers, you plant them at a much closer spacing than you would if you had them out in the ground bed. So whether it be the petunias and alyssums there on the left, or the coleus, verbenas, and petunias in the center, or the calibrachoas, petunias, coleus, geranium Alternanthera and Spiky Dracaena on the right, we're cramming a lot of plants into a small space because we're doing that in a container. Speaking of containers, I thought worthwhile to speak just a little bit about some techniques for containers that are specific for our small space planning here. Oftentimes, it's important to think about the size of the container you're going to be growing things in. You can get some huge containers. The one on the left there showing a Abyssinian banana and begonias and sweet potato vine and sedum. So that container is about 4 feet square, and you're going to need something that large for something of that scale. You can also grow things in much smaller containers, as we see on the top right photo there, grouping of various houseplants with containers that are no more than 6 to 12 inches in diameter. And when you've got containers that small, they do need to be put together in a grouping such as we see here to provide enough scale and proportion for most situations. At the bottom we see a grouping of succulents, and that's another thing to think about when you're doing containers is make sure that the plants that you have grouped together have similar needs so that you can take care of them similarly. Also important as we think about our container media, container growing, that we think about the media. You're going to use a much different soil growing media or soilless growing media than you would if growing out in ground beds. You see a picture here of a commercial nursery potting a bunch of perennials up in their commercial potting mix. And at the right is the soilless mix that we use at the ISU greenhouses. Most of these commercial soilless mixes have a peat base with perhaps vermiculite or perlite mixed in, but really no garden soil at all to allow for better drainage and aeration. Of course, one of the things with container growing is that, as I mentioned before, you may have more maintenance involved. So watering can be an issue. You might take care of that by setting up something like a drip irrigation as you see there on the left, with a main supply line and little spaghetti tubes going to the individual containers. Or get one of your grandkids to water the containers for you. Catherine loves to get the hose out, and of course we get a little bit wet ourselves as well as the containers, but it's fun for the grandkids to have that little chore of watering the containers. At the right, we see what are called dositrons used at our ISU greenhouses. Those are fertilizer injectors that go into the watering line. Now, you're probably not going to set up that fertilizer injector system at your home on your home containers, but just a reminder that you are going to need to fertilize those container gardens more frequently than you would in-ground beds, because as you water, you leach some of the nutrients out of the soilless mix. Let's take a little time now for another discussion here. Have you think a little bit about what sort of small space gardening techniques do you use in your garden or have you seen used? And as we've started our discussion, have you thought of any techniques that you might want to use in your garden next year? So let's take a few minutes to discuss that, and then we'll come back in a few minutes to talk about some other small space examples that I can show you. All right, welcome back once again. As we talk about provide you with some of these small space examples, I hope it gets your mind flowing about what you might do for small space gardening techniques in your own situation. So raised beds are certainly a great small space example. We've got vegetable raised beds there on the left. That's actually a polycarbonate type material that's not true wood, so it's going to last for at least 20 years. You can see some cabbage and leeks and a few marigolds planted there, some beans and some potatoes in the background, all using that wide row gardening technique. The big advantage, of course, of raised beds is that they make it easy to amend the soil. You get faster warming in the springtime, better drainage in case you have wet conditions. And that's one of the situations on the right there. This is a raised bed, ornamental bed of begonias and Moses in the cradle and some other ornamentals that I saw in Panama this last year, where they get more than 100 inches of rain a year. So drainage can be an issue, but by just raising it here about 8 to 12 inches, all of these plants will thrive and grow very well. A pyramid garden is a sort of a special type of raised bed. One of the most typical pyramid garden plants is a strawberry, which you see there on the left. And I've seen commercial ones done in circular pyramids. Here's one that would be fairly easy to construct on your own out of 2x6s. To create a bit of a pyramid. So you've got the strawberries. It makes it a little bit easier to harvest some of those because they're raised up a little bit for harvest. On the right is a pyramid garden of lettuce that was created at Ryman Gardens a couple years ago, done hydroponically. So the water flows through the troughs there that the lettuce is growing in. But you could set up a similar pyramid without having to do it hydroponically. You'll just need to put soil in the troughs and water frequently to keep it. Makes a lot of harvest out of a very small space by doing that pyramid garden. Perhaps a little bit more of an extreme of a pyramid would be to be what we call a tower garden. So rather than having just a few layers, you go up here, as you can see, maybe a dozen layers or so, with the plants planted kind of on the outer edges of those planting beds. So just keep stacking and stacking and stacking. Both of these examples are from Ryman Gardens. The one on the left are all chrysanthemums. So this is one of their fall displays where they've got the chrysanthemums growing in a pyramid. At the right, this is a tower of the sweet potato vine, calabrachoas, petunias, the silvery dichondra, and some yellow bidens in there. I've also seen towers made out of just all one type of plant, for example, petunias, where you just make a circular ring out of reinforced wire lined with landscape fabric, and then you make little planting holes through the fabric into the growing medium in the middle of that ring to create a tower. A fun way to get a lot of color and vibrancy in a small space. You can also grow vegetables in towers like these. So if you've got a limited area, you can get a lot of vertical space out of the tower gardens. Of course, wall gardens have become popular in the last few years, whether it be in wall, such as we see here. At the left, that is Nepeta or catmint and Sedum sarmentosum growing through the cracks in a retaining wall. This is just outside the Memorial Union on the ISU campus, and it's really quite attractive pretty much all season long. For one, that Nepeta blooms pretty much all season long. The Sedum sarmentosum, of course, has the succulent foliage that looks attractive all season long. Wall gardens have also become popular indoors, and on the right you see an indoor wall garden with earth star or cryptanthus, some ferns, coffee plant, arrowhead plant, and let's see, is there anything else? Oh, there's a Tradescantia or Zebrina in there as well. on these indoor wall gardens, you basically need to set up some sort of trickling water to come down, and that's the catchment basin there at the bottom with the black rocks to catch the water and recirculate it. We also might extend that wall garden concept to plants that grow on walls. So here we see a few examples. At the far left, that's a type of senecio that's growing on a security wall. That security wall is about 8 feet tall with the metal grating on top. So it would have been a very stark wall without some sort of plant material growing on it. And the senecio does have holdfasts that will hold it against the wall, so it covers up and makes a more attractive appearance. Of course, is also the ivy-clad brick walls. Whether it's English ivy or Boston ivy, they're common types of ivy that grow on the wall. And you can also do wall hangings, if you will. Here's a geranium planter that hangs on the wall of the back of my house, covered by a deck cover, so it's not in full sun, so it doesn't dry out too badly. A little less common are what I call railing containers. These are containers with a split down the middle so that they kind of go saddleback on top of a fence or railing. In the situation on the left here, this is actually at Proven Winners out in Bonsall, California. They, of course, have a privacy fence, but all along the full length of the privacy fence, they have their colorful annuals that are cascading down. Here you can see some petunias. That's a juncus or rush. That's the upright grassy material. There are alyssum, some purple verbena, and the golden straw flower in there. So just a continuous planting all along the top of the fence with a container that kind of hangs over both sides. You can do it on a much smaller scale too, as we see on the right there. This is a deck railing that has some Dracaena spikes, geranium, the vinca vine, and helichrysum or strawflower vine. Trough gardens would be another example of small space gardening, where you make these containers out of hypertufa, so they're lightweight enough to move around. And you can grow succulents or other perennials in there, and they'll withstand our winter conditions. So on the left, we've got some sedums and a heucherella, is a shade-tolerant plant related to heuchera. At the right, those are all various sempervivums, or hens and chicks, growing in that hypertufa container. Using a succulent such as this makes the care a lot simpler, because they don't need to be watered very frequently, nor should they be fertilized often. Bag culture is a relatively new technique, and in the instances that you see here, these are actually rooftop gardens where growing in other types of containers may be more difficult. The advantage of the grow bag is that they are basically made out of a material kind of like landscape fabric, so they have real good aeration. When the roots of the plants that are growing in them come out to the edge, they're automatically root pruned, so that they won't start circling and create girdling roots within the pot. They'll actually be root pruned and cause the roots to branch out. So on the left, that's a willow arbor. The willow is planted one side and arched over to another planting, so you make an archway there. The photo on the right, again, this is a large bag. This one's about 4 feet in diameter, but it's been turned into an herb garden. So you can see some lemon verbena there, some sage, and Cuban oregano. Looks like some parsley in the back there as well. So a nice little herb garden out of this bag culture. Here we see examples of rooftop gardens, or we may call them green roofs. The one on the left is a bicycle rack cover in Columbus, Ohio that I saw this. And the one on the right is a chicken coop that has a green roof of various types of sedums and sempervivums or hens and chicks. Fun way to grow a few more things and be green at the same time. Balcony gardens, another great example of a small space area. The one on the far left is in Eureka Springs, where the fire escape serves also as a balcony. So you can see the top one has just containers growing on the floor. The middle one has containers hung on the railing, and the bottom one is more of the using the railing itself as the holder for the plants. So fun one there. The center one is a typical site in much of South Europe. This one happens to be in Madrid. These little sort of Juliet balconies, just literally covered with geraniums. So lots of plants growing there in that very small space. And the one on the right, you sort of see these terraces of different floor levels of this particular apartment building, and everyone has some geraniums or shrubs or something growing out on their terrace or balcony. Similar to those balcony gardens might be what we call our window box gardens. If you don't have a full balcony, you can still reach out the window and take care of your window box right outside. On the left, there's a nice little formal window box with some English ivy, sweet potato vine, a geranium, and little miniature arborvitaes. Of course, those will not last long in that site, but they make a good one-season planting in there for a little evergreen effect, and then it can be planted out elsewhere in the landscape for growing on further. At the right, so a lot of bright color with verbena and petunias kind of cascading down along this limestone wall with the open window there, ready to take care of them and water them. Pallet gardens are a fun way for kids to get involved in the gardening, especially if you paint them very brightly. The photo on the left is from the Michigan State University Children's Garden, so I'm sure they had the kids paint the moon sign there and other ones. So if you have a painted palette such as this, you're probably not going to want to completely cover the area with plants. You can see there's some petunias cascading down across some of the plantings, but they're rather sparsely planted so that they don't cover up the artwork. It looks like they are just filled with potting soil. Oftentimes when you do a pallet garden like this, you need to line them with landscape fabric so that the soil doesn't wash out of them. I didn't see the landscape fabric on those at the children's garden. I guess if they're protected enough and you're very careful with watering, you may not need that landscape fabric liner, but otherwise probably better to line them with landscape fabric and plant through the landscape fabric. In more instances, it's more like the right situation for a pallet garden. You can still see a little bit of pallet there, so you know that this is a pallet, but you're typically not wanting to make the pallet the focus of the garden. So cram a lot of plants in there. There's a mix of annuals and perennials. There's dusty millers, some petunias, some lamium, some gara. So a lot of things growing together, all of them sun lovers, so they'll grow well in that vertical pallet garden. Tabletop gardens are another way to grow plants in small spaces, whether it be in containers such as the wicker baskets on the left with the tulips and violas for a little spring effect on your outdoor table garden. Or if you want to go really high end, you can do a table with flowing water and planters built right into the table. This is a metal table that allows for the succulents that you see there to grow in the depth of the table with a little river of water flowing through. This again was at Proven Winners, so they have a little bit bigger budget than most of us might have. But you could, I'm sure, come up with a planter built right into your table too, so that you have a built-in centerpiece. Hanging baskets, of course, are great examples of small space technique. At the far left there we have a begonia and English ivy planted in a cone-type hanging basket. Makes a nice statement there. You see hanging out of a tree, so a good one for the shade. You could also hang it, under a covered deck or something like that. Hanging baskets also great for hanging off lampposts, like we see in the center there. A couple fairly large baskets that are filled with sweet potato vine, some purple lobelia, some geraniums, and some petunias. And then you can really go ultimate as the one on the right. This is at Ball Horticulture, where they've got these huge frames that create a sort of arched walkway, but they've got lots of hanging baskets at the top of those frames, so you're walking underneath the bright color that they've got throughout the whole grounds there. Knot gardens are another example of small space gardening, whether it be simply from the shrubbery, like those are two different colored barberries there on the left, creating a bit of a knot garden with a decorative armillary, or in the far right one, that is trimmed boxwood, creating a knot garden, and that's ageratum and marigold, creating the color in between. This is particular garden also has a multiple layer, if you will, in that there are species tulips planted in the center part with the sundial, and crocuses planted in the quadrants where the ageratum is. So there's one flush of color in the springtime, and then the annual flowers get overplanted for the summer and early fall coloration in this particular knot garden. A mailbox garden is another idea that a lot of people use and have. The one on the left is mostly coleus with a little bit of sedge there with a grassy material, and there's some potentilla and flower carpet roses there around too. So this is a way of you've got sort of a limited space there around the mailbox, but a way to brighten up that mailbox without causing problems for the mail carrier to deliver the mail. At the right, you see another example of a mailbox garden where that is sweet autumn clematis cascading down the brick pillar that holds the mailbox. And then there's yucca there in the foreground and some daylilies to add a little bit more color, a little bit more substantial, and a perennial type mailbox garden. All of these plants, of course, can handle the heat that's present there out by the road and with the brick pillar. Speaking of heat and difficult growing conditions, you may have what I call a hell strip. And the hell strip is that area that some people call the parking between the sidewalk and the roadway. This is a really difficult area for lots of plants to grow, so you have to grow ones that are adapted to heat and drought and poor growing conditions. You can see here's an example of my hell strip garden, or one of my hell strip gardens, at various angles and various times of the year. So some of the plants I grow there, that's the hibiscus in the foreground on the left, some vinca, annual vinca, also some color from some knockout roses. At the right, on the upper one, You can see some purple foliage from my ornamental cotton. There's some daylilies blooming there. The calla lilies are done blooming. There's some nicotiana, some acorus. Those are summer flowering alliums, Allium tanguticum, in full bloom there in the sort of the center upper portion of the picture. All these plants really are quite drought tolerant. And I also sometimes have put in annuals in this bed. So the one at the bottom, those are alyssum, petunia, kale, and cosmos. So all of these have the same color palette, but they work well in this little health strip garden area. Another small space area would be between pavers and stepping stones. Most of the time you're going to be using a little creeping ground cover here, like creeping thyme and flagstone there on the left, or sedum in between flagstones as in the middle picture, or Irish moss around steppers as we see at the right. All these make great little ground covers that help for a little small space garden example. And we've already talked about containers to a certain extent, but thought it would be good to put them back in again here. Different kinds of containers you can use and come up with all sorts of creative ways of growing plants in containers. The one on the left there is a repurposed fountain that's got the sedum sarmentosum kind of cascading down much like water would, so it has that effect of cascading water. You've got sort of the classic look in the center there of an urn with cascading begonias, creeping jenny, that make a nice combination for that shade garden. And then on the right, another urn filled with shade-tolerant plants. There's a tuberous begonia, diamond frost euphorbia, and a couple different caladiums. Make a bright, colorful combination for that shade garden container. So, to sort of wrap up here, we want to have you take a little more time to discuss here what other ideas you might have come up with, or what this presentation may have spurred in you for small space gardening methods. So take a few minutes to perhaps discuss that among those of you who are there watching today, and we'll come back for one final wrap-up. So, welcome back again. We just want to thank you for watching the presentation on small space gardening today. And you can see my email there. If you have questions, feel free to email me, and I will respond as best I can and as quickly as I can in case you have questions about small space gardening techniques. Thank you for participating today.